One of the main key characters when it comes to the village of Carne itself is of course Enri, and Enri is a major key role in this village to the rise and sort of the establishment of it becoming a major player in the story of course, Overlord, the anime and the light novel. She is definitely a character that has no background when it comes to her name, she has no wealth, she has no significant skills when it comes to academic or even physical. She is basically the most plain and basic character that you could ever imagine at the beginning of the light novel series, which is of course volume 1, when she was introduced, as well as the village as well. But what I think is most amazing about characters like that are just plain, boring, got no name to them, no wealth, nothing to sort of work from, is that them going from that to something amazing, to growing, to building, to establishing wealth and power and knowledge. And I wouldn't say necessarily she possesses wealth in the sense of monetary gain, but she definitely possesses a lot of wealth in the sense of power over others and using the wealth of the town itself to establish a strong foothold. There is definitely a lot of wealth of riches and resources around this town, whether it be herbs, fruits, etc. Especially in the forest itself, there is definitely a good variety of different resources in there that can be used. Even though, yes, the forest itself is very dangerous, this has allowed her to step up as a leader role, especially with dealt with a very interesting hand herself. She's been put in a very dangerous situation. She was facing death itself until Ainz stepped out there to sort of test things out, and that was definitely the main reason for him to go out there. He wanted to learn about the land, test some of his skills, and just understand the difference between the game and this new world that he had been teleported to. Of course, with a bit of nudge from Sebas himself, and then he decided to bring Alberta with him. This allowed him to sort of establish an understanding of the world itself, which allowed this lovely meeting between, of course, Enri and Ainz. And of course, there was some questions to be asked because he was definitely a shady character just popping out of nowhere, handing health potions that did not look like a normal health potion to Enri. Of course, he possessed great far quality of a health potion, but from that fateful meeting, things established. This allowed her to grow a greater understanding of just how vast and dangerous the world is, the kind of people out there that are willing to do harm to their village. And of course, Ainz giving her not just the potion itself, but also the horns itself that allowed her to summon goblins, which she decided to use. This did not just allow her to gain a small military footing in the sense of using these goblins that she summoned to be able to defend the village from outside influence, but this of course allowed her to have labor to help with mundane chores. Gathering, chopping wood, just helping with the village and establishing this village upwards so that it allowed them to feel more secure. Again, this is a very community-based village. They all help each other, they all contribute, and it's very much a place that doesn't foster greed itself. If you came in there to just try and make a quick buck or try and use and manipulate these people, it will not work, because this village is very much built around a community of helping each other. But I think the major reason why this defense was ended up built in place was because of the influence and the events that transpired in the Undead King arc, which of course is volume 1 of the light novel fans and season 1 of the anime fans, which is a major event that I think was definitely a big shift for the town itself. This is the major reason that this village is very skeptical of outside influence, and one of the major pushing factors in why they decide to go more towards wanting to be under Ainz's rulership, because of the fact that Ainz was willing to put himself in possible harm's way to protect the village itself. Again, the village doesn't know that Ainz was in no danger whatsoever, but to the way they see it, he was willing to put himself in danger to protect the village. And of course, they see the amount of raw power that he possesses. He was able to summon a Death Knight, he was able to take on the Sunlight Scripture, which they were trying to lure Gazef Stranoff out there so that they could remove him out of the picture. And that is an event that transpires that is of no consequence to the village itself. They have no part in it. They've got no influence in the events. They were just merely bystanders that ended up being part of the casualty because of these two powers trying to fight against each other. And Ainz is just merely an influence that just happenly decide to go on Gazef's side, which is the major first step in this village going towards Ainz' side because of the fact Ainz shows compassion, shows caring. And I think this definitely shows that if maybe someone else from the tomb was an influence on Ainz, maybe things could have turned out very differently. But I think also Ainz wanted to use the village to gain some knowledge and some information about the world itself and just how vast and different this world is, of course, to the game and the real world that he again was born in. But after those events that transpired, we go into the Dark Warrior arc, which definitely shows that the actual village has become more fortified, it's become more unified. The goblin troops themselves are helping in very productive ways. They are sort of preparing for the possibilities of other outside influences trying to be more of a negative influence on this town and doing harm to them. They've learnt from their mistakes and they've, again, adapted to very dire situations. Something may bad happen again or something may not bad happen again, but they are preparing for what could happen, and that is a very smart move. It's strategical. Again, you don't just leave your door wide open and think, oh well, no one's going to come in, and then after someone does, you just leave it open again for a second round. You try and fortify, you try and put things into place to protect yourself and those around you that you care about. And as I said before, and I mentioned this in a little bit of detail, is that the village is very close. They work as a sort of community. They share income to a certain degree. They share resources. They help each other the best they can, which weeds out greed. That is the same concept here. They're all trying to protect each other, so using the goblins to fortify the village to not just protect Enri, but the entire village is the major point of why, again, they decided to end up fortifying the village itself. But there's also more mouths to feed as well. Even with that small goblin army, they need to, again, feed those mouths and those villagers. So they've used this sort of situation that has been given to them from Ainz to allow them to, one, fortify, and B, use the labor from the goblin troops to gather resources, again, from the forest itself to feed and grow this town even more. And surprisingly, the town does continuously grow throughout the light novels and the anime itself. And 3 notable times where this village ends up growing quite significantly is, of course, with the ogres themselves that they end up acquiring because, of course, Enri shows her full strength, which really is more just a facade to kind of make them think that she's more powerful than she really is. And that's the one thing I've always loved about the goblins. They are very fun and charismatic characters that definitely put a smile on my face when reading the light novels and seeing the anime. They definitely put a cheery mood on the village itself and, of course, Enri and those close to her. Even though, yes, they are quite fond of her in other ways that definitely lead to some awkward questions, they are characters that I really enjoy because they just bring a more fun, energetic moment to the actual light novel and the anime. But not just that as well, is when, of course, Ainz decides to bring over the dwarves themselves, which is, of course, part of the Craftsman of the Dwarf arc, where Ainz goes out to the Dwarven Kingdom and acquires some runesmiths, and then he decides to station them in the town itself because, of course, it's a nice, safe space for them to work in, which grows this town even more. Those are the 2 notable times where a different group of individuals actually come to the village itself. But the big notable time where the goblin army grows even more significantly is when 5,000 more goblins are summoned from the horn itself because Enri ends up acquiring certain skills that allow her to make a giant army to defend the actual village itself. So a small village that is very small, very minor, doesn't play a very major part in the actual grand scope of the world itself, and Enri being a nobody, again, as I said before, no money, no name, no knowledge, no wealth in the sense of knowledge and power and name, ends up becoming such a powerful figure in the world itself. Some may not know of her because of how far-reached the world itself is, but some definitely know about her power and influence because of the fact that now she has a 5,000 strong goblin army. And not just that, but also runesmiths and ogres themselves. This small village became a powerhouse very quickly because of the influence of Ainz. And whether this could have shifted in a different direction if Ainz decided to do something very different is, again, completely up question in a theory itself. But I truly believe that Ainz saw a potential that he just kind of winged it along and went with it, and it just grew into something big. Again, he utilized the knowledge, he utilized the power, and he was trying to be helpful by handing the actual horns itself and this just ended up being a good reward that he was able to reap. Where this village goes in the sense of more power and influence is definitely going to be a wonderful question that we're just going to have to wait and see where it goes in the light novels. But I think the big thing to be asking is how they're going to be feeding these troops for substantial long periods of time. I'd assume they will grow crops, etc., which they are doing even when the goblin army itself was much smaller and it was more just a sort of small ragtag team. They were growing crops, herbs itself, and going out into the forest to gather stuff, which, as I mentioned before, is a good resource gathering. But of course that wouldn't be enough. They would need to actually grow crops itself and also have animals there as well. This is something that is going to be a bigger issue because of the fact that they now have dwarves, a larger goblin army, ogres, and of course that village is going to be constantly shifting and changing in size depending on what goes on in there, if you catch my hint, because she's definitely a thirsty individual if you've read the light novels and maybe seen some subtle hints in the anime. But a quick extra thing to also know is the actual reason for Enri to summon the actual goblin army a second time, because of course she had two of the horns. She summoned the first one a while back due to obvious reasons of her needing manpower, protection, etc. Then she ended up using it at a second time, and this was used in a more dire situation. She was desperate, she was backed into a corner because of the royal army that came to the village and threatened to completely decimate the village. This is one of the big things that pushes the village more in the direction of following under Ainz's leadership because of the obvious outside influences that have shown a negative impact. They've had the sunlight scripture show a very nasty side to just how vicious the world is out there. Yes, Gazef was out there to try and defend them, but Ainz was the big major reason why they were protected the first time, and then of course Ainz ended up saving Gazef. Yes, Gazef tried to do right, but this royal army is showing an even more vicious side to the very people that they're meant to be neighbors to. And because of the fact that they rock up, they throw all these threats out, and they don't want to break Ainz's loyalty that they have with him because of the good deeds he's done, this ends up backing them into a corner where they try to fight back and ends up leaving Enri in a desperate and dire situation, which leads to her summoning the goblin horns again. But I think one of the last things to take away from this is the fact that yes, Enri is a powerful influence now. She definitely has a large army behind her, but I don't think necessarily this army is going to be used in a big military standpoint unless she's been pushed into it, or unless Ainz decides to drop by and say, hey, can I use your army for any particular reason? I don't think he'd really ever need to, because he's got his own army, he's got the Floor Guardians, so for him, he would never need to use it. I think he'd be definitely curious at how she summoned this army itself, because this is something that he's definitely been quite puzzled by, because again, she met certain criteria that were needed to be able to summon this goblin army, which has definitely been a fun debate amongst light novel and anime fans all alike, discussing on what she did to meet these criteria. And I think just leaving it up in arms has been sort of more of a fun way of doing things. But I think also the bigger question to ask here is where this town is going to go, not from a military or politics standpoint, but from a technological standpoint, because Ainz is utilizing this town to try and acquire and tap into unknown knowledge. Ainz knows knowledge is power, and he is trying to tap into knowledge that has not been tapped into by other outside influences yet, that being higher quality potions so that Ainz can mass produce on them, and also the rune crafting itself. Rune crafting is something that Ainz wants to tap into because there's the possibility of being able to produce things that he could normally create that require resources, but with rune crafting it might be able to jump over some of those resource requirements. Ainz is trying to find ways to do things without needing to do certain other aspects. He's trying to learn as much as he can and acquire as much knowledge and power over possible enemies that he may find in this world itself. Of course, we light novel readers know otherwise, but for Ainz, he is a very paranoid individual, so he's constantly trying to sift and learn for more knowledge in the hopes of using that against his opponents. And again, mass producing good quality potions or even high quality potions is something that I think he is hoping to aim for. Whether the lovely potion master ends up gaining that ability to make higher quality potions to the point of what Ainz possesses is the next thing to be asked. But of course, the Potion Master is able to go up to purple color, which is definitely an improvement. It's definitely a one step upwards, but now we're just going to have to see how much further he can go with that. And of course, where the dwarves decide to go with their knowledge and their research on rune crafting as well. This town definitely possesses a lot of influence in knowledge, power, politics, and just influence overall. But again, as I mentioned before in the early stages of the video, this was a village that possessed nothing of great value, but was influenced greatly due to the certain events that were done by the Sunlight Scripture, and of course Ainz as well. It put them into motion, and it changed the large landscape, and the forest itself connected to the village itself has been a great resource gathering for them that allows them to gain, as I said before, herbs and fruits, and now they've had to build other things and other forms of resource gathering so that they can continuously feed this ever-growing village itself that, again, to me, is pretty much turning into a full-blown city because of the fact that they now have a 5,000 strong goblin army. And I'd be interested to see in the light novels itself what it looks like, how this village has transformed. That is something that I'm hopeful of seeing in the later on volumes. We'll just have to wait and see. But I'd also love to see just other influences that end up impacting them. Other towns, other villages, other cities and empires out there, and Ainz and the tomb itself, because the goblins themselves and the original goblins that were summoned, they are definitely some fun, charismatic characters, but they also have some interesting interactions with some of the Pleiadian maids, and a particular one that is definitely more, I would say, feisty, but definitely shrouds that in a sort of mist of mystery. She definitely hides that dark and more evil personality, which these goblins can see through, and they've been very concerned about her. These goblins are I would say, a fun little thing to add to the village. They definitely have their own strengths and weaknesses. Yes, they may not be super powerful troops in compared to, say, like the Pleiadian maids or the actual floor guardians, but they aren't weak in any way, shape, or form. They are definitely a powerful actual army itself, and having those original goblins there have always been sort of just a fun touch to the village as well. But overall, I'd love to know your thoughts in the comment section down below. What do you like about the village? What would you like to see transpire in the later on volumes of the actual village itself, and what influences do you think they're going to have on the world itself? But if you like this video, hit the like button, subscribe for more anime content, and I'll see you, beautiful nerds, in the next video.